Did you hear that? What? I said. That, Diane answered. And now that I was awake, I did hear it. It was kind of a shuffling, moaning, scratching sound. And I suddenly remembered where we were and how I'd gotten there. Diane and I were vacationing in Australia, and we were currently driving around the island state of Tasmania. And we were staying at the Seaview Lodge Host Farm. We checked in earlier in the day because it was on our way to Port Arthur. So to get there, you have to drive up this kind of windy, twisty gravel road through the forest. And then it opens up and you're on the top of the hill and you can see the bay. And so there we are. We drive up, and the lodge itself, that was kind of stretching the truth. The lodge, it was sort of this ramshackle building, kind of had been built haphazardly, very asymmetrical. And as we pulled up, a guy walked out and came over and introduced himself as Vince with a cheery, "G'day, how you going?" And he said we could go in and pick any room that we wanted. And then he paused and said, "You'll be my only guests for the evening." So we went in, and this place had no less than a dozen rooms. Each room had like 6 bunk beds in it. It had 2 kitchens, 4 bathrooms, this huge living room with a mishmash of furniture and a window that looked out over the bay. So we tossed our stuff on the bed of the room and went out and headed off for Port Arthur, the infamous penal colony. Now, back in the 1800s, the British had the great idea of sending all of the criminals to Australia. It was like the dungeon down under. And the worst of the worst were sent to Tasmania. So it was like the dungeon down under. And as if being on an island 100 miles from the mainland wasn't bad enough, this prison was at the end of the Tasman Peninsula, surrounded by shark-infested waters. And it was now a popular tourist attraction. So we were headed there to take the ghost tour because it happened to be Valentine's Day. And we wanted to make it memorable. And, you know, what says romance by, like, being scared out of your wits with the one that you love? So the tour started about sundown. So we showed up, and our tour guide met us, Macca. And he's there with about 20 other people, and we each got a little lantern to carry so we could light the way. But it didn't really light the way. It was really more like a little circle of light at your feet and then just cast sort of shimmering, sinister shadows out to the side. And I was starting to question the romance in all this. First stop was the parsonage where the Reverend George Eastman and his wife lived with her 10 children. And George had died under mysterious circumstances in the upper bedroom. And rumor has it you could see lights flashing mysteriously, or you could hear footsteps running up and down the stairs. So we all crowded into the front room and shuffled around waiting for George or the kids to make an appearance. But of course, ghosts don't show up on cue, and especially not for 20 people. They prefer smaller groups so they can pick you off one at a time. So from the parsonage, we moved on to the separate prison. Right? We walked up this steep hill. And amazingly, Macca explained to us that back in the day, the Port Arthur prison was actually the cutting edge of prison reformation. They had finally figured out that traditional methods of punishment, like flogging, didn't seem to reform the prisoners. It either hardened them or it killed them. But then they thought, well, maybe if a man could just sit in quietness, he could contemplate his sins and turn away from evil. So they built the separate prison. And if the parsonage had been kind of a creaky farmhouse vibe, okay, the separate prison was definitely like a sinister, full-on creepy experience. It was cold, it was dark, and as soon as we stepped inside, it was like the light from our lanterns got sucked into the cold, damp stone walls. Macca explained to us that the prisoners were kept in these thick-walled, tiny cells for 23 hours a day, and the guards wore felt slippers and used sign language, so it was absolutely no sound. When the prisoners were let out for that 1 hour, they couldn't speak, and they had to have hoods over their head. It was total sensory deprivation. So we walked around and into some of the cells, particularly into one William Carter cell, who had hung himself with a leather strap rather than endure this place. And when I went in there, it was like the despair and sadness just oozed out of the walls and into me, and I wondered if William had ever found peace. Not surprisingly, many of the inmates went mad. And while this was an unintended consequence, they had conveniently built the asylum right next door to the separate prison. And we walked out of the prison, past the asylum, and then Macca pointed out in the bay a small island, which he said was the island of the dead. And on that island, there were 1,500 bodies buried in unmarked graves. And it was said that these spirits could never rest because they weren't named, and so they would rise up out of their graves in the night, and they would go off in search of someone who would recognize them and help them move on. And it wasn't hard to imagine with the mist over the water that there were 1,500 ghosts coming my way. I felt like goosebumps and chills the whole time. When the tour was over, we got a certificate saying we had bravely and with courage survived the Port Arthur ghost tour, and we took off for our 20-minute drive back to the Seaview Lodge. Only this time when we turned onto that twisty gravel roadway, it's pitch dark and it's like a tunnel we're going through. And we start seeing these flashing lights kind of on the side of the road. And we realize it's our headlights reflected back of animals in the woods and on the side of the road. I can only assume marsupials because I have a lot of those in Australia. But then we came around the corner, and in the middle of the road was this small black furry creature making a meal of another small furry creature. Diane's like, "What is that?" I'm like, "It's a Tasmanian devil!" And my palms got sweaty on the steering wheel and were slipping, and it looked up at us, and it had these red, kind of glowing eyes, and its face was all red, I can only assume from the blood of whatever it was eating at the time. And we just kept creeping closer and closer, and it just kept eating and eating. Finally, when we were almost on top of it, it slunk off into the bush. So we carried on up the road through the gauntlet of flashing eyes until we got to the lodge. And we went inside, and we started whispering. I don't know why, because, as Vince had said, there were no other guests. And it was kind of like the silent prison, because it was cold, it was dark, and there was a lot of rooms. So we just decided, let's get in bed, hunker down, pull the covers up. And that was all well and good until Diane woke me up with a, "Hey, did you hear that?" Suddenly I'm wide awake, and I'm wide awake in the way that you are when you dream that you're falling, and right before you hit the ground, you wake up and your heart is pounding, rapid breath. Diane's like, "Do you think maybe it was William or George or one of the 1,500? Half joking, half serious. I said, "I don't know. Maybe we need to hold up our certificate as a protective shield." Instead, we got out of bed, had our flashlights, and started creeping through the lodge. And at the time, I remembered thinking that every teenage slasher movie I'd ever seen had taken place at either a camp, a hotel, or a farm, and we were staying at a combination of all three. So as we crept along, all of a sudden the noises stopped. So we stopped. And then they started. So we started. And we kept up this auditory, nocturnal game of red light, green light all the way through the lodge till we were back at our room. We still didn't know where the noise was coming from or what was making the noise, but decided again, let's just get back into bed, flashlights in hand, put a chair up against the door. Of course, if it was one of the ghosts, that probably wasn't going to help us, but we felt better. We felt better. And I guess we must have drifted back off to sleep, because the next thing I knew, I had woke up and there was light coming through the window. And I'm like, "Diane, wake up. We're alive. Let's get the hell out of here." So we grab our backpacks and we head out the door, putting our stuff in the car. And Vince, the guide, the local host, comes strolling out. And he walks by and he's like, "Hey, I hope the wombat didn't keep you up last night." And he said this very nonchalantly, but with kind of this gleam in his eye. I said, "Wombat?" He's like, "Yeah, it lives under the lodge, and sometimes at night it can make a lot of noise." He chuckled. I said, "No, slept great. Slept fine. We're just getting an early start off to Hobart." I don't know why I didn't want Vince to know that we hadn't slept well. I think I just didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing that omitted bit of information had scared the hell out of us. But as we drove away and Vince kind of receded in the rearview mirror, and I turned around and I looked at that big window in the living room, and I swear I saw this blurry little silhouette in the corner, and I had wondered if it was George or one of the 1,500 or just an overactive imagination and frayed nerves. And I'll never really know, but I couldn't help thinking, "Wombat my ass." Thank you.